All right, so let's get this one over with. We're going through another game test now. It's been several days of these. We're looking at Battlefield 5 DLSS. We actually started this several days ago, and we pushed the content back a couple extra days to look deeper and try and find something positive with DLSS. We're sure you've seen the criticism online. We were working on our content at about the same time as everyone else working on it. And after seeing the sort of global response to DLSS basically being Vaseline on the screen, we decided to do anything to try and find a more, just something that made it, well, look better. So we tested RTX 2060s, 2080 Ti's. We did a couple of different game graphic settings. We did multiplayer, single player, stuff like that, trying to find the good in DLSS. And, well, we're not completely empty-handed. But let's just talk about it in this one and do qualitative and quantitative tests with DLSS in BFV. Before that, this video is brought to you by the Gigabyte Z390 Aorus Master motherboard, which comes equipped with one of the more powerful Z390 VRMs for heavier overclocks on the new 9th gen Intel CPUs. The Aorus Master is also one of the few motherboards with a real heatsink this generation, featuring a mix of high surface area fins and looks-oriented cover blocks. Oh, and it's also got updated RGB illumination. Learn more at the link below. In working with DLSS, which requires DXR to be enabled and does not have an off option for ray tracing, we've noticed that there seems to be some sort of gradual memory leak in Battlefield 5 with DXR enabled. We haven't been able to confirm this with 100% consistency or confidence, but it happens enough that we're at least somewhat confident in talking about it as an issue. Over a period of time related to the GPU memory available, the game seems to eventually slow to a bit of a crawl. We noticed this most prominently on the maps Devastation and Rotterdam. The RTX 2060 at even just 1080p with low DXR settings would bottom out at 0 FPS for long intervals, sometimes completely crashing. This seems to coincide with memory filling up, but it wasn't just that the 2060 was doing it because of a 6 GB limit or something. Our 2080 Ti with DXR on the higher two options also begins to encounter hard stutters occasionally in testing. We have not been able to reproduce this issue with DXR and DLSS both disabled, but we have reproduced it on two systems with two different RTX GPUs with some consistency, but not 100% consistency. The memory seems to be fully allocated on each device when this happens, so our speculation, and it is pure speculation, mind you, so we may be wrong on this, is that it's a memory leak of some kind within the game code. The 2080 Ti will sometimes take 20 minutes to start encountering these occasional stutters, so we don't see it in our brief test passes. And then as a side note, with DXR in Unreal Engine, we've noticed that there's a similar sort of slowdown over time. So this may just be a DXR issue within Windows. That would be Microsoft's domain. They actually make a DXR and then NVIDIA plugs into that. So it may be a wider issue with DXR, but either way, we wanted to point out that there are occasional memory leak issues in Battlefield 5 with DXR enabled, and that would also go with DLSS being enabled. We're going to put some DLSS on and off comparisons on the screen now, but we won't reveal which is which and what the resolution settings are until the end. You should look at this and personally determine which you think looks best, then we'll reveal which is which later. We'll keep the left and the right consistently one setting so that they remain the same as we change footage or screenshots. You just pick which side you think is the best. Looking at DLSS from the perspective of quality, our very first impression was that the differences were difficult to see in actual gameplay. Like DXR ray tracing, when you're actually playing the game, Battlefield 5, these things sort of get overlooked in favor of, well, playing the game. As we used DLSS more across more maps and began to really scrutinize it, sometimes with faces 1 inch away from the monitor, we noticed that it almost seems to remove a sharpening filter. And then as you sort of sit back and look at it wider, you don't need to be that close to the monitor to notice the lack of the sharpening, because once movement slows down, once you stop running around and you just camp somewhere for a second, which is real gameplay, you'll notice that it looks sort of blurry. And this effect, this blurring or lack of sharpening, becomes more noticeable as you look for it or as you become aware of it. So this is not something that we noticed immediately, but of course noticed within, well, a couple of minutes of actually playing around and looking at it. So we're not sure if there's a literal transaction going on where there's a sharpening filter or a post-process sharpening effect that's being applied and then removed with DLSS. But in before and after comparisons we have of Rotterdam, Devastation, the shooting range, and single player, we notice that DLSS off shots always look like they're significantly sharper than DLSS on. This is not good or bad, really, it's sort of subjective, but in general, most people do tend to like the contrast or the sharpness based on comments online about this issue. So you could look at this two ways. Either there's some sort of sharpening post-process that happens with DLSS off and that's removed with DLSS on, or that isn't true at all, and DLSS just does this, and that's probably the worst of the two options given those two. Let's reveal which side has been using which settings now. If you chose one and now disagree with your choice, that may be a bias. If you couldn't tell the difference between them, that's also noteworthy, because then you should clearly just use whichever is better insofar as performance benchmarks, and that's always going to be the lower resolution with DLSS off, giving you better performance and really in a lot of instances either indistinguishable or better visual quality, depending on your preferences. And of course, YouTube compression might also kill any minor differences, so that's of course a consideration as well. Back to it though, the idea is that DLSS should make it easier to run DXR. We've already seen that this is objectively true. NVIDIA has done well with delivering on that promise, but it's still even easier to just use the next resolution class down when speaking strictly to performance. And the looks, as we've shown, are either not that different or are maybe a little bit better with that lower resolution, although you might not like the sharpness. There's some instances where we can see DLSS being better, and we'll talk about those in a bit. We already showed some charts for that stuff. What we need more of is qualitative versions of this discussion. So here's your point of consideration. The lower resolution and DLSS off tests, like 1440p instead of 4K DLSS, still show sharper objects than with DLSS enabled and 4K resolution. After NVIDIA's blog post, we also decided to test the RTX 2060 for this with 1080p and 1440p. We thought maybe this one would be better, would have either better quality or make more sense because it's a lower end card. This set of tests also, however, showed us that the DLSS images were less sharp. They were, in some instances, just plain blurry, almost like there's a constant layer of motion blur applied, even when the camera's not in motion. We saw something similar in the initial execution in Metro, where it looks sort of like with RTX GI on, there's that layer of motion blur. DLSS also impacts the object render distance, where some objects get completely cold with DLSS on. This is something we noticed in the single-player French campaign level in the mud. Distant trees, for example, were getting cold with DLSS, but remained present with DLSS off. There were only a few objects where this happened, but it did happen, and of course, the more you play the game, the more you'll find of those. In the same vein, DLSS impacts LOD scaling and object detail in distant objects, visible plainly in some of the neighboring trees in those clips earlier. We can see that the branches sort of pop in and out. You lose some of the height or the depth of the trees depending on the LOD scaling. We wanted to wrap our content here originally, but figured that there had to be a benefit somewhere. So we looked, and we searched on multiple GPUs, and after suffering some memory leak issues, we eventually found an area of debatable improvement. In the multiplayer map on Rotterdam, shot from the spectator view in the clouds, we noticed that the thin geometric detail on ships, like the masts, and on the train would alias heavily with DLSS off and running 1080p. Remember, this is an RTX 2060, so it's realistic you would run that resolution. This was aliasing to the point where there's almost a marching ants effect as you move around. It could be considered annoying, maybe, if you're really looking at that. With DLSS on and 1440p, those objects either get sampled out and omitted, maybe not the best, or get smoothed out, depending on which object it is and how much data there is for DLSS to work with. This is not necessarily good or bad in an objective form, but it is something for you to determine the value of. In general, if you have to look that hard for a positive difference, it's probably worth just leaving it off. In our previous DLSS benchmark with Final Fantasy 15, we found that 1440p resolution always produced better performance than 1440p with DLSS, faking 4K and super sampling, which we can show again on the screen now. In that video, we also talked about the pros and cons of each configuration. Sometimes, like with the license plate text that we showed in the Final Fantasy benchmark, DLSS was arguably better for legibility than just straight 1440p, but of course 4K was better than both. Unsurprisingly, it was worse always than real 4K, but that's because DLSS is meant to sort of fake 4K and improve your frame rate at the same time, which is what we're looking at today. In other instances, DLSS was significantly worse than 1440p, like where we had flickering and fences and light fixtures, whereas 1440p looked normal and without those anomalies. We talked about much of this and chalked it up to a semi-random seed being generated to alternate where on the screen DLSS was sampling. This, we assumed, was true because even when paused, the menu screens would still show flickering and objects that have really thin geometry or are just maybe using alpha textures or something like that, both of which can describe the fences where we saw flickering. So the example of flickering when paused does coincide with maybe some sort of semi-randomization in the sampling pattern or something like that, since it's not fixed. But when in movement, it makes more sense that it is flickering as it is because you're starting to sample around these really thin pieces of geometry or really thin elements like in the fences in a way that it might just slightly miss the actual piece of metal, hit some of the background, and then you get a super sampling of that, which is no longer accurate. So that explains the flickering in that game. We didn't see it quite the same as we talked about earlier for Battlefield 5, but for Battlefield 5, our first benchmark sequence, we'll look at one of the more intensive single-player levels and ultra presets for the 2080 Ti, but with RTX only set to low. We'll look at RTX Ultra next. For this one, 1440p with DLSS off and RTX low, once again chart tops, but that isn't really surprising at all. The question, as we answered earlier, is more about what looks better. This is the other half of that equation though. With DLSS off, we're at 82 FPS average with lows reasonably timed at 59 FPS 1%, 55 FPS 0.1%, using, again, our 1440p setting, where you actually can't enable DLSS if you wanted it. Our standard deviation is minimal in these tests, as you can see in the bars on the graph, so these numbers are fairly consistent run to run. The 82 FPS average puts us at 9% faster than 4K with DLSS off, but with RTX completely disabled. If you wanted to play at true 4K at a reasonable frame rate, clearly it's possible by completely disabling RTX and just using normal, in quotes there, game graphics settings. Enabling RTX but keeping DLSS off drops us to 52 FPS average, so like for like, we drop from 75 to 52 FPS and lose 30% of our performance instantly with RTX set to low. This is in a scene that doesn't have much actual ray traced reflections. There's not really a lot going on for ray traced reflections. It's constantly processing, but that doesn't mean it's really showing you anything. And that's not to mention some of the visual artifacts that we can show as well, like fire shimmering in the camera despite no fire being actually nearby or relevant to our viewport. The comeback story is with DLSS, sort of, where we instantly gain 27% performance to 66 FPS average from 52 FPS average. Even still, this is worse than 1440p with DLSS off and RTX low, unsurprisingly, and worse than just disabling RTX and playing with 4K instead. It all comes down to image quality, and we'll put one of those comparisons back on the screen now. If 1440p with DLSS off looks worse than 4K with DLSS on, and it's noticeable and frequently worse, then DLSS is worth it. If not, it's clearly not worth it. We've given you the tools to decide for yourself what you think, but we'll loop back on this more in the conclusion. Let's look at the next test, and it's in the same area, except it's now with RTX set to ultra from low, so all of this is the same except RTX. 75 FPS average is the high, set by 4K DLSS off and RTX completely disabled. This now surpasses 1440p in this particular test as opposed to the previous one, and that's because the 1440p tests are now working with RTX set to ultra instead of low. The end result is that we lose 20% of our performance from the previous chart's 82 FPS average high, now ranking below 4K with DLSS off and RTX completely disabled. Big important note there. If you wanted to keep RTX on, you could either take 1440p and RTX Ultra or 4K with DLSS on and, to some extent, RTX Ultra, which lands us at 54 FPS average. This is still worse than 1440p baseline, which had us at a 21% higher frame rate. If you wanted a more like-for-like comparison, going from 4K with DLSS off at 37 FPS average to 4K with DLSS on did provide a noteworthy improvement of 45%. That's a damn good jump. It's just that 1440p is probably still better or functionally equivalent for most people. So at that point, we question whether the gain matters in this particular game. That said, as a technology, clearly there's an uplift in performance here. It's not really that new of a technology. The implementation is new, but the idea isn't. So there is a gain. It's a big gain too. It's just that it's not, you're losing some image quality there. So maybe this is promising for other applications. We just need to see if those ever come to fruition and be convinced from an image quality standpoint. The performance standpoint, there's a good argument. We really need to see that image quality standpoint though. Finally, just for one more charted area, we also tested the practice range for the opposite load level of the previous single player level. The practice range is probably the lightest weight area of the game. It's not really that representative of actual play, but it's still useful for just kind of the opposite end of things. So this almost never uses RTX reflections. We thought we'd look at it as a performance trial. 1440p leads once again, although FPS scales higher in all tests as a result of the simpler environment. We're at 103 FPS average with well-timed lows versus DLSS Off, RTX Off, and 4K at 90 FPS average. With 4K DLSS Off, we're plotting about 56 FPS average, still a steep decline from the 78 FPS average with DLSS On. Let's instead look at frame time performance. As always, frame time plots are useful for their more accurate representation of frame-to-frame performance rather than potentially averaging out any important data points. Lower is better for frame-to-frame interval, shown as frame times on the left axis, but more consistent is better still than lower. For this one, we can first plot 4K with DLSS Off and RTX On, showing frame times between 22 milliseconds and about 37 milliseconds. The frame-to-frame variance, which is what we actually care about, isn't all that bad here. There are a few spikes greater than the desirable sub-8 millisecond variance, but overall the so-called smoothness is fine. It's not high frame rate, so that's not great, but the consistency is acceptable. For reference, 16.667 milliseconds is about 60 FPS. For the 4K DLSS On test, drawing that line now, we see performance significantly improve over DLSS Off, and those few larger frame time spikes also now vanish with this run. Reducing the workload on the GPU overall helps to ensure more consistency frame to frame, which is also significantly advantageous versus 4K with DLSS Off. So it appears that DLSS is working. It's doing well for performance. It's just that there's those other problems. So again, this option does not exist in a vacuum. And 1440p posts better frame rate with similar frame-to-frame intervals, resulting in the best overall experience. In fact, the frame-to-frame intervals are better on average by at least a couple of milliseconds. The longer the line, the higher the FPS here, and of course the shorter the line is on the left axis, the lower the frame time, also a good thing. So we see that the 1440p line ends up with the most frames drawn. It has the best frame rate. It's also the most consistent. So really it's just objectively the best insofar as performance. So going back to the image quality scenario is the only fallback for DLSS. And this illustrates well why 1440p remains the best option in this use case from at least an objective standpoint. That's what we have for you then. So we had, I guess, memory issues notwithstanding, which do seem like they might be just related to DXR and Windows in general, because we're having those issues in Unreal Engine too. So those things notwithstanding, DLSS, it's just at a point where it's like, even editing back the video, Andrew was saying he could barely tell the difference. And when we were playing the game, we could barely tell the difference until you have to stop and look. And then, yes, you can see it. But like when we first started playing the game, and you're actually playing it, like for real, not just walking around aimlessly trying to find differences. You're actually playing the game. The differences are very difficult to spot because a lot of the time it amounts to some blurring of the textures, some loss of detail, some of the sharpening is gone. But a lot of the time, those elements aren't things you're really paying attention to when you're trying to shoot people in the game. So the differences overall in action are not that noticeable, and that's not really a good thing. It might sound like a good thing in some ways because we're not saying it's worse, or well, noticeably worse when you're really playing. But it's really not a good thing because, again, you can drop the resolution, you can get a better performance uplift as a result of it, because it's straight 1440 instead of 1440 super sampled, which is what DLSS is. And so because it's straight 1440, performance is up, and then it's a bit sharper, things like that. Now, Sharpness is sort of up to debate to some extent, whether you'd like it or not. We showed footage earlier, but for the most part, you really do have to just like kind of pause and look really close to the monitor to try and see those differences when you're first trying to spot them. But when you see them, I mean, it is really obvious. Like once you start noticing the differences, suddenly you can't not see them. So definitely DLSS is overall lower image quality, we would say, to some extent objectively. On the subjective side, there are some debatable areas of improvement, like maybe, for example, in the masts in the ships, in some of the train prefab elements, stuff like that, small mesh details, things where it's really thin geometry. There's not much geometric complexity there, or maybe an alpha texture or something like that. You start seeing some debatable improvement, and that's mostly in just either it misses when it samples and it doesn't hit the small piece of geometry. It samples everywhere around it, and then you lose that context, so it doesn't get drawn in the super sampled version, or you hit it and it gets almost like emboldened, at which point the aliasing issues go away with the marching ants effect on those masts and other thin geometric elements or alpha textures or whatever. So that's kind of what we're dealing with. It comes back to the same philosophical thing as some of the other stuff we've looked at with RTX, where if there is some sort of improvement, but you have to look really hard to find, you have to do what we're doing for a job to find it, then does it matter? And if there's a performance uplift and there's an arguable, maybe sometimes improvement, sure, turn it on. But if there's not a performance uplift, there's actually a detriment, and the benefit is exceedingly rare or completely subjective, that's where it gets either easy to say turn it off and just drop the resolution, or if it's subjective, then obviously look at it, figure it out if you like one more. Now, overall, reading the comments online, it looks like the verdict is more or less that people don't like DLSS in Battlefield 5. We don't really have a extremely firm stance on this one. It is not impressive. It is not necessarily adding meaning. Well, let's rephrase that. It is not adding meaningfully to performance. That's very firm. So then it just comes down to, does it add to the look? And really overall the answer is no, not really, because the only way, by and large, for most scenarios in the game that it benefits the visuals is if you don't like the sharpness. Maybe you feel like the sharpness in Battlefield is unrealistic, and maybe you feel like it should be a bit blurrier or at least less defined, and that's potentially a valid criticism. So in that case, sure, turn it on, but it's kind of the wrong reason to turn it on. So that's really where the problem is that's not the benefit that's intended. So so if there's benefit there, absolutely feel free to use it. We're not telling you not to, but it's just, it does not seem to be quite what we were expecting. And NVIDIA, interestingly, has painted itself into a corner because it promised the world when it brought this technology onto display in Germany, and people are now expecting NVIDIA to do what they said, would happen. And it's not there yet. So maybe DLSS will get there. Some of this stuff is just, it's a matter of like not losing some of the detail. This is a technology that's supposed to improve over time. It has fed more ground truth images and improved in that way. But it remains to be seen how good DLSS can be if it can get to really where it needs to be. Final Fantasy we showed previously, showed a few clips in this video, and it just was not on average a very good experience to enable, because you start getting flickering and disappearing objects and thin mesh materials disappearing. LOD scaling changes sometimes unfavorably when you could just drop resolution and call it a day. So not particularly impressed. It's not the worst thing in the world, but it's just either you don't notice the difference or you don't like it, and neither of those is a great option because performance is down regardless. So that's it for this one. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more. Go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to support us directly in what we do, or you can go to store.gamersnexus.net to pick up a GPU artifacting shirt like the one I'm wearing right now. It's on the store for $20. So thank you for watching. Subscribe for more. I'll see you all next time.